All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of our World War II lecture. So, as war raged on in Europe, FDR was determined that, quote, America would be the arsenal for democracy, end quote. He was skillfully isolationist and shared the general American sentiment in public that this was not America's war, but in private he was preparing to go to war. He would build support for the war through his 4 freedoms, which we will talk about later in the lecture, and he believed that America would help spread democracy across the globe. So tensions had been rising between Japan and the US, although the US was not officially involved in the war yet. FDR seized all Japanese assets in the US in retaliation for the Japanese occupation of French Indochina, and the US placed an embargo on Japan on July 26, 1941. And many see this as the leading factor to Pearl Harbor. So on December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Oahu by surprise. 21 US ships were sunk or damaged, 188 aircrafts were destroyed, and 2,403 were dead. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the US, and this would be the first and only time Hitler would officially declare war on another country. The US officially entered World War II with public support after Pearl Harbor. So waging war against Germany and Japan required all of America's immense industrial capacity. So on December 18, 1941, Congress passed the War Powers Act. This act gave the president far-reaching authority to reorganize government agencies and create new ones, regulate businesses and industry, and even censor mail and other forms of communication. So Roosevelt replaced the agencies he had created to combat the Great Depression with another outpouring of organizations to fight the Axis powers. The War Production Board was created by FDR in 1942, and this oversaw the wartime economy and directed the conversion of industries to war production. So it was really just like a pumped-up version of the first New Deal's National Recovery Administration. The Supreme Court unanimously declared the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional in 1935 because it granted the federal government what the justices deemed to be inordinate power over private industry. However, in the time of war, the American people and SCOTUS were much more willing to give the government this power, even just if temporarily. So the agency enticed corporations to meet ever-increasing government orders by negotiating lucrative contracts that helped underwrite their costs, lower their taxes, and guarantee large profits. The government also suspended antitrust enforcement, giving private companies a huge amount of leeway in running their enterprises. As a result, corporate net profits nearly doubled, and by the end of the war, the 200 biggest American companies controlled half of all of America's corporate assets. So this really paved the way for a closer relationship between government and private defense contractors, later referred to as the military-industrial complex. This central control of industrial production transformed the nation's economy into the world's most efficient military machine. By 1945, the year the war ended, the U.S. was manufacturing half of the goods produced in the entire world. American factories were running 24/7, and they could produce an airplane every 5 minutes and a ship every day. This represented a huge conversion from private production to wartime purposes. In 1941, more than 3 million consumer automobiles were manufactured in the United States. Only 139 were built during the next 4 years, as automobile plants began making tanks, trucks, jeeps, and warplanes. This is how total conversion from consumer to military production this was. Even more than in World War I and the New Deal, the size of the federal government soared during the Second World War. So more than a dozen new federal agencies were created, and the number of civilian federal employees quadrupled from 1 million to 4 million. The need for the U.S. not only to equip and feed its own military forces, but also provide massive amounts of food, clothing, and weapons to its allies, created shortages of virtually all consumer goods that caused severe price increases. In 1942, Congress responded by authorizing the Office of Price Administration to set price ceilings. With prices frozen, basic goods had to be allocated through rationing, with coupons doled out for limited amounts of sugar, coffee, gasoline, car tires, meat, etc. The government promoted patriotic conservation by urging every family to become a fighting unit on the home front. Businesses and workers often grumbled about the wage and price controls, and on occasion the government seized industries threatened by strikes. Despite these problems, the effort to stabilize wages and prices succeeded. In all, government control over prices, wages, rents, and production represented a massive, but in many ways temporary, expansion of federal power. So financing this enormous enterprise took a considerable amount of effort and money. The federal government spent more than $320 billion, 10 times the cost of World War I. For context, this would be worth more than $4 trillion in today's dollars if you account for inflation. So the federal government's expenditures during the war were twice what they had been in the previous 150 years combined. To pay for all of this, the federal government sold $185 billion in bonds, but the rest came from increased taxes. So Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1942, which is also called the Victory Tax, and this for the first time affected low and middle income workers who had paid little or no income taxes before. Whereas in 1939, only about 4 million people, or 5% of the workforce, filed tax returns, the new act made most workers taxpayers, 75% of workers taxpayers. And by the end of the war, 90% of workers were paying income taxes. In the end, increased government revenue was not able to cover the cost of the war and the national debt. By the end, this was 6 times what it had been at the start of